Welcome to Dr. Harmony, the place where we peel back the layers of human nature to reveal the shadows lurking behind closed doors. Have you ever wondered how much a soul can endure before it finally snaps? Today's story isn't just about betrayal. It is about the cold, calculated rebirth of a woman left for dead by the very people who promised to love her. We are diving deep into a tale of psychological warfare, hidden agendas, and the ultimate price of underestimated strength. If you believe that karma is a dish best served cold, you are in the right place. Fasten your seatbelts, because this journey from the ashes of abuse to the heights of power is one you will never forget. Let's begin the story of Elena, a woman who proved that silence isn't weakness, it's a countdown. The rain lashed against the cracked window of the small, suffocating kitchen, mirroring the storm brewing in Elena's chest. At 35, she felt a century old. She stood by the stove, her hands trembling as she stirred a pot of soup that smelled of salt and exhaustion. In the other room, the television blared, a constant drone that served as the soundtrack to her misery. Her husband, Mark, sat on the sofa, his presence a heavy, useless weight in her life. He hadn't looked for work in 3 years. His days were spent in a haze of cheap beer and resentment, fueled by the venomous whispers of the woman sitting across from him, his mother, Beatrice. To Beatrice, Elena was not a daughter-in-law. She was a servant, a punching bag, and the scapegoat for every failure that had befallen their family. Beatrice entered the kitchen, her footsteps sharp like a death march. She didn't speak at first. She simply walked to the stove and peered into the pot. With a sneer, she grabbed the ladle and threw it back in, splashing boiling liquid onto Elena's wrist. Elena gasped, pulling her hand back, the skin instantly turning a raw, angry red. Beatrice didn't apologize. Instead, she leaned in, her breath smelling of bitter tea and malice. She told Elena that she was as useless as the dirt on her shoes, a woman who couldn't even provide a decent meal, let alone a future for her son. The insults were familiar, a rhythmic chant of worthless and failure that Elena had heard every day for a decade. Mark watched from the doorway, his eyes blank, offering no defense, no comfort. He was a hollow man, a puppet controlled by his mother's strings. That night, something inside Elena finally fractured. It wasn't a loud break, but a quiet, chilling realization that if she stayed, she would die, perhaps not physically, but her spirit would be erased. She waited until the house was silent, until the rhythmic snoring of the two people who had hollowed out her life filled the air. She took nothing but a small bag of essentials and the few $100s she had hidden inside a hollowed-out book over the years. As she stepped out into the cold night air, the rain washed away the grime of her old life. She didn't look back at the house that had been her prison. She walked until her legs ached, until she reached the bus station, and she bought a one-way ticket to the furthest city on the map. She was 35, penniless, and alone. But for the first time in her life, she was dangerous because she had nothing left to lose. The first year was a blur of survival. Elena worked 3 jobs, scrubbing floors in the morning and waitressing until the early hours of the dawn. She lived in a room no bigger than a closet, but it was hers. In the silence of that room, she began to reinvent herself. She realized that the world only respected power and image. She used her meager savings to take night classes in marketing and public relations, discovering a natural talent for manipulation and storytelling. She learned how to craft a persona, how to make people believe in a version of reality that didn't exist. She watched the way successful people moved, the way they spoke, and the way they used their influence as a weapon. Elena was no longer the girl who cried in the kitchen. She was a student of the game, and she was playing for keeps. By the 3rd year, the transformation was nearly complete. Elena had landed a job at a high-end fashion firm, starting as an assistant and quickly climbing the ladder by outworking and outmaneuvering everyone in her path. She changed her name, her hair, and her voice. She became a woman of mystery and elegance, a rising star in the industry who everyone wanted to know but no one truly understood. She was building an empire. But her foundation wasn't built on ambition alone. It was built on a burning desire for retribution. Every contract she signed, every promotion she earned, was a step closer to the day she would return to that small, suffocating house. She didn't just want them to see her success. She wanted to be the architect of their total and utter ruin. As Elena climbed the ranks of the elite, her transformation was not merely physical. It was a total recalibration of her soul. In the 5th year of her disappearance, she had become a household name in the world of luxury branding. She was the woman who could turn a failing boutique into a global powerhouse with a single social media post. Her face, now polished and radiating an icy confidence, graced the covers of business magazines. She moved through galas and boardrooms like a predator in silk, but every night, when the lights went down in her glass-walled penthouse, she looked at a folder hidden in her safe. It contained photographs of a dilapidated house and 2 people who had grown older, meaner, and more desperate in her absence. Back in the stagnant town she left behind, Mark and Beatrice were drowning. Without Elena's income and her tireless labor to keep the household running, the walls were literally closing in on them. Mark had managed to find a job at a local warehouse, but his laziness and entitlement got him fired within months. He spent his days sitting in the same spot on the sofa, which was now stained and sagging, complaining about how the world had cheated him. Beatrice, her hair now a brittle white and her face etched with permanent lines of bitterness, had turned her venom toward her own son. They lived in a cycle of mutual loathing, screaming at each other over the cost of electricity or the lack of food in the pantry. They were ghosts haunting their own lives, unaware that the woman they had broken was now the one holding their fate in her manicured hands. Elena knew that a direct confrontation would be too simple. She didn't want to just walk in and show off her wealth. She wanted to dismantle their lives from the inside out, the same way they had dismantled hers. She began her move by hiring a private investigator to map out every debt, every secret, and every weakness they possessed. She discovered that Beatrice had taken out a predatory loan to pay for Mark's mounting legal fees after a drunken altercation at a bar. The house, the only thing they truly owned, was the collateral. This was the opening Elena had been waiting for. She didn't buy the debt herself. She created a shell company, a faceless entity that started to squeeze them, sending letters that turned Beatrice's arrogance into cold, hard fear. The psychological game was the most delicious part for Elena. She started making her presence felt in small, ghostly ways. She would send anonymous packages to the house, luxury catalogs featuring her own face on the cover, or high-end perfumes that Beatrice could never afford. She wanted them to see what beauty and success looked like, to make their own squalor feel even more unbearable. Mark would flip through the magazines, his eyes lingering on the woman on the cover, never once realizing it was the wife he had treated like a doormat. He would comment on how some women had it all, while he was stuck in a dump. The irony was a poison that Elena fed them in small, controlled doses. As the debt company turned up the heat, Beatrice became frantic. She tried to sell her meager jewelry, but it was worth nothing. She tried to ask neighbors for help, but she had spent decades alienating everyone in town with her sharp tongue and judgmental attitude. No one was coming to save them. This was the moment Elena had prepared for. She orchestrated a random encounter. She arranged for a prestigious real estate firm secretly under her control to contact Beatrice with a miraculous offer. They claimed a wealthy developer wanted to buy the land to build a luxury resort and was willing to pay triple the market value. To Beatrice and Mark, it looked like a lifeline from heaven. To Elena, it was the noose. The day of the meeting arrived. Elena didn't show up herself. She sent a team of high-powered lawyers to the local diner, a place where Beatrice used to take Elena just to humiliate her in front of the waitstaff. Mark and Beatrice arrived, looking disheveled, trying to put on airs of importance that fell flat against the professional backdrop of the lawyers. They were greedy, their eyes shining with the prospect of millions. They signed the preliminary documents without reading the fine print documents that shifted the title of the house into a trust controlled by Elena's firm, but with clauses that made the payout dependent on background checks and property inspections that would take months to clear. They were now technically homeless, living in a house they no longer owned, waiting for money that would never come. Elena watched the footage from a hidden camera her team had installed under the guise of an insurance inspection. Seeing Beatrice's shaking hands as she signed the papers gave Elena a rush of adrenaline she hadn't felt in years. But it wasn't enough. She wanted them to feel the sting of betrayal from someone they trusted. She began to leak information to Mark through a fake social media profile, a beautiful woman who took an interest in him, making him feel like he was still the charming man he thought he was. He began to steal the little money Beatrice had left to invest in this new woman's business ventures, creating a rift between mother and son that turned their home into a literal war zone. The trap was fully set. Elena sat in her office, looking out over the city skyline, a glass of vintage wine in her hand. She was no longer a victim. She was the director of a tragedy, and the final act was about to begin. She checked her calendar. In 2 weeks, the eviction notice would be served. In 2 weeks, she would make her grand entrance. She wanted the weather to be just right, cold, gray, and unforgiving, just like the night she left. She practiced her smile in the mirror, ensuring it held no warmth, only the sharp edge of a diamond. The countdown to their ultimate humiliation had reached its final seconds. The wedge between Mark and Beatrice grew into a chasm of paranoia. Elena, operating through her digital alias, had convinced Mark that he was a misunderstood genius, a man who had been held back by 2 ungrateful women, his mother and his former wife. She sent him digital investment portfolios that were nothing more than empty spreadsheets filled with glowing numbers. He was so blinded by the attention and the prospect of easy wealth that he didn't realize he was siphoning away the last of their emergency savings. Beatrice, meanwhile, was losing her mind. She could feel the walls closing in, the debt collectors calling at all hours, and the sudden, strange silence of a town that had finally turned its back on her. Elena decided it was time to introduce a new layer of psychological torment. She sent a documentary crew to the town, claiming they were filming a segment on small-town downfalls. They interviewed neighbors who, emboldened by the cameras and the promise of a small fee, laid bare every sin Beatrice had ever committed. They spoke about her cruelty to Elena, her arrogance, and her habit of looking down on everyone while her own house was rotting from the inside. Elena watched the raw footage from her office, sipping her coffee with a cold, detached fascination. She saw Beatrice try to chase the crew off her porch with a broom, looking like a crazed, broken old woman. The image was a far cry from the terrifying matriarch who had once burned Elena's skin with hot soup. While Beatrice was distracted by the filming, Mark was spiraling. Elena's fake persona told him that for their future together to work, he needed to prove his independence. She suggested that his mother was the anchor dragging him down, the reason he had never succeeded. Mark, fueled by years of repressed resentment and the desperate need to feel powerful, began to talk back. The arguments in the house became legendary. The neighbors could hear the screaming matches from a block away. Beatrice accused Mark of being a lazy parasite. Mark accused Beatrice of being a bitter crone who had ruined his life. They were tearing each other apart exactly as Elena had planned. Elena knew that the most painful betrayal isn't from an enemy, but from the hope of a better life. She had her legal team send a letter to Beatrice, stating that the luxury resort project was moving into the final phase. To secure the multi-million-dollar payout, the owners had to vacate the property for 48 hours for a final environmental assessment. They were told they would be put up in a 5-star hotel in the city, all expenses paid. For Beatrice and Mark, this was the ultimate victory. They packed their best clothes, which were still ragged and out of date, and prepared for their trip to the city, believing they were finally entering the world of the elite. When they arrived at the hotel, they were treated like royalty. Elena had instructed the staff to give them the golden treatment. They were served champagne they couldn't pronounce, and food they didn't recognize. For one night, they lived the life Elena lived every day. They sat in a gilded dining room, bragging to the waiters about their upcoming windfall, unaware that every person in the room was an actor hired by Elena's firm. They were being pampered in a bubble of lies, a high-altitude peak designed only to make the coming fall more lethal. Mark even tried to call his online girlfriend to tell her he had finally made it, only to find the account had been deleted. Back at the house, Elena's environmental team was actually a cleaning and repossession crew. They weren't testing the soil. They were removing every stick of furniture, every stained carpet, and every shred of evidence that Beatrice and Mark had ever lived there. Elena had purchased the entire block through her various shell companies. She didn't want to build a resort. She wanted to turn the land into a community center for abused women. She wanted to erase their existence and replace it with a monument to the strength they had tried to crush. The house where she had suffered was being hollowed out, its dark corners finally exposed to the light. The next morning, the golden treatment at the hotel ended abruptly. When Beatrice and Mark went down to the lobby for breakfast, they were stopped by security. Their credit cards, the ones provided by the real estate firm, were declined. The hotel manager, no longer smiling, informed them that their reservation had been canceled due to irregularities. They were escorted out the front door into the biting morning chill, their cheap suitcases rattling on the pavement. Panic finally set in. Beatrice tried to call the lawyers, but the numbers were disconnected. Mark tried to check his investment app, but it was gone. They scrambled to find a way back home, using the last of the cash Beatrice had hidden in her shoe to pay for a grueling 6-hour bus ride. They huddled together, not out of love, but out of a shared, terrifying realization that something was horribly wrong. The bus dropped them off at the edge of town, and they began the long walk to their street. As they turned the corner, they stopped dead in their tracks. The house was unrecognizable. It was surrounded by a high chain-link fence, and a massive sign stood in the front yard. Future site of the Elena Foundation, a sanctuary for rebirth. They stood there, frozen, as a black limousine pulled up to the curb. The tinted window rolled down slowly, revealing a woman who looked like a goddess of vengeance. She wore sunglasses that cost more than their house, and her smile was as sharp as a razor. Mark squinted, trying to recognize the face. Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her throat as she realized who was sitting in that car. It was the useless girl. It was the servant. It was Elena. And she wasn't there to welcome them home. She was there to watch the final collapse of their world. The silence on the street was deafening, broken only by the low hum of the limousine's engine. Beatrice's jaw hung slack, her eyes darting from the high-end vehicle to the massive sign bearing Elena's name. Mark looked like he had been struck by lightning. He took a stumbling step forward, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. Elena didn't step out of the car immediately. She let them simmer in the realization. She watched through the tinted glass as the reality of their homelessness collided with the image of her immense success. The power dynamic had shifted so violently that the air itself felt heavy with the weight of her return. Finally, the door opened. Elena stepped out, her heels clicking against the pavement with a rhythmic, predatory precision. She looked impeccable in a tailored charcoal suit, her hair flowing like liquid silk. She didn't look like the woman who had scrubbed their floors. She looked like the woman who owned the world. Beatrice finally found her voice, though it was cracked and shrill. She began to scream, a torrent of old insults mixed with new demands. She demanded to know what was going on, where their furniture was, and how Elena dared to stand there looking the way she did. She still tried to command the room, failing to realize she was no longer in a room, she was on the street, and she owned nothing. Elena didn't flinch. She didn't even raise her voice. She waited for Beatrice to run out of breath, her expression one of mild, polite boredom. When the older woman finally stopped, panting and trembling with rage, Elena spoke. Her voice was calm, melodic, and terrifyingly cold. She informed them that the house had been legally seized due to the default on the loans they had so recklessly signed. She explained, in painstaking detail, how every opportunity they thought they had found over the last few months was a thread she had pulled to unravel their lives. She told them that the real estate firm was her, the lawyers were hers, and the investment app Mark had wasted their money on was a ghost. Mark's face turned a deep, bruised purple. He tried to lung toward her, his instinct to use physical intimidation taking over, but he was stopped instantly. Two large professional security guards stepped out from the car behind Elena's limo. They didn't have to say a word. Their presence was enough to make Mark shrink back into his shell. Elena looked at him with a pity that hurt more than any insult. She told him that she had spent years wondering if he was truly evil or just incredibly weak. Looking at him now, shivering in a cheap jacket, smelling of desperation, she had her answer. He wasn't a villain, he was a shadow, a nothingness that only existed because his mother allowed it. Beatrice tried a different tactic. She began to wail, dropping to her knees in a display of manufactured grief. She tried to invoke the family bond, reminding Elena of the years they had spent under the same roof. She even had the audacity to claim she had been tough on Elena to prepare her for the world. Elena laughed, a short, sharp sound that cut through Beatrice's performance like a knife. She reminded Beatrice of the soup, of the nights spent sleeping on the floor, and of the way they had conspired to keep her trapped in a cycle of poverty and self-loathing. Elena leaned down, getting close enough for Beatrice to see the total lack of mercy in her eyes. She whispered that the preparation was over. Now, it was time for the test. Elena handed them a small, plastic folder. Inside were the eviction notices, a list of their total debts, and a one-way bus ticket back to the city, to a homeless shelter she had specifically chosen for its strict rules and harsh conditions. It was the same shelter she had once walked past during her first year of struggle, the one she had promised herself she would never enter. Now, she was giving them the gift of a fresh start, exactly where she had begun. She told them they had 10 minutes to leave the property before the police arrived to trespass them from her land. The neighbors began to peek out of their windows, some even stepping onto their porches to witness the downfall of the town's most hated residents. Beatrice looked around, hoping for a sympathetic face, but she found only cold stares and satisfied smirks. The community she had bullied for decades was now enjoying her public execution. Mark looked at the bus tickets, then at the limousine, his mind still trying to find a way to grift his way back into Elena's good graces. He tried to apologize, his voice shaking as he told her he had always loved her, that his mother had forced his hand. Elena didn't even acknowledge the lie. She simply checked her watch. 8 minutes, she said, turning her back on them. She climbed back into the warmth of her car, the door closing with a solid, expensive thud. As the limousine began to pull away, Beatrice threw a rock at the car. It bounced harmlessly off the reinforced glass, a pathetic gesture of a woman who had lost everything and still couldn't understand why. Elena didn't look back. She had a meeting with an architect to discuss the layout of the new foundation. The past was a ghost she had finally exorcised. As the car sped toward the highway, Elena felt a lightness in her chest. The revenge was complete, but the story of her life was only just starting its second act. The limousine sped away, leaving a trail of dust that seemed to settle on Mark and Beatrice like a funeral shroud. They stood on the sidewalk of the street they once ruled with petty tyranny, now reduced to spectacles for the neighbors they had long despised. The reality began to sink in with the cold weight of a tombstone. They had no home, no money, and no allies. Mark looked at the bus tickets in his hand, the paper crinkling under his trembling grip. He looked at his mother, the woman who had been his North Star, and for the first time, he saw her not as a powerful matriarch, but as a delusional, broken, old woman. The family they had built on a foundation of abuse had finally collapsed under the pressure of Elena's success. As they boarded the bus back to the city, the atmosphere was thick with a silence that screamed. Beatrice sat by the window, her eyes fixed on the passing landscape, her mind racing to find someone else to blame. In her narrative, she was the victim of an ungrateful, conniving girl who had used witchcraft or luck to steal what was rightfully theirs. She began to mutter under her breath, a low-speed litany of curses directed at Elena. Mark, sitting across the aisle, ignored her. He was staring at the reflection of his own face in the grimy bus window. He saw the wrinkles, the slackness of his jaw, and the emptiness in his eyes. He realized that Elena hadn't just taken their house, she had taken their dignity, leaving them with nothing but the truth of who they were. The city greeted them with the harsh, indifferent roar of traffic and the smell of exhaust. The shelter Elena had chosen was located in a district where the buildings looked like they were leaning on each other for support. It was a place of gray, concrete, and iron bars. When they arrived, the line for intake was already stretching down the block. Beatrice, ever the aristocrat of the gutter, tried to push to the front, demanding a private room and decent service. The security guard, a man who had seen everything the city had to throw at him, didn't even blink. He told her to get in line or get out. For the first time in her life, Beatrice was just a number. She was forced to stand in the cold for hours, her feet aching in shoes that were falling apart. Inside the shelter, the conditions were a mirror of the psychological prison they had created for Elena years ago. The air was thick with the smell of industrial bleach and unwashed bodies. They were assigned narrow cots in a massive room filled with hundreds of other lost souls. There was no privacy, no comfort, and no respect. Mark found himself surrounded by men who had much tougher stories than his own, men who saw through his pathetic attempts to act superior. By the second night, his designer jacket, the one he had bought with stolen money, was taken from him while he slept. He woke up shivering, too afraid to even complain to the staff. He was learning the lesson Elena had learned. In the dark, everyone is the same. Elena, meanwhile, was not content to just leave them in the shelter. She wanted to ensure they stayed there, unable to claw their way back up to a position where they could hurt anyone else. She used her influence to blacklist them from every reputable employer in the region. She made sure their story, the tale of their downfall, and the reasons behind it was circulated in the local news and online forums. She framed it as a cautionary tale of the dangers of family betrayal. When Mark tried to apply for a simple janitorial job, the manager recognized his name from a viral post and laughed him out of the office. They were being erased from the productive world, relegated to the margins where they had once tried to push Elena. In the shelter, Beatrice's mental state began to fracture. She started telling anyone who would listen that she was a wealthy socialite whose vile daughter had kidnapped her fortune. The other residents mocked her, calling her the Queen of the Gutter. She would sit in the common area, her hands moving as if she were still stirring a pot of soup, her mind trapped in the kitchen where she had once felt powerful. She was haunted by the image of Elena's face in the limousine, the cold, unyielding beauty of a woman she couldn't break. The soup she had used as a weapon was now a ghost that haunted her hunger. She was starving in a world of plenty, a victim of her own greed. Mark tried one last desperate move. He found a payphone and tried to call the office of the Elena Foundation, hoping to beg for a job, a handout, or even a moment of her time. He practiced his apology, making it sound as sincere as a man like him could manage. When a receptionist finally answered, he broke down, sobbing into the receiver, claiming he was a changed man. The receptionist listened for a moment before her voice turned icy. She told him that Miss Elena had anticipated his call and had a message for him. The only thing you are entitled to is the consequences of your own actions. The line went dead. Mark stood in the rain, the dial tone buzzing in his ear like a swarm of hornets. Elena watched the logs of the rejected call from her high-rise office. She felt no joy, only a profound sense of justice. She wasn't doing this out of petty anger. She was doing it to balance the scales. She had spent years being the nothing in their lives, the invisible force that kept them comfortable. Now, she was the invisible force that kept them accountable. She turned her attention back to the blueprints on her desk. The community center was ahead of schedule. She was building a place where women could find the resources she never had: legal aid, job training, and a safe haven. She was turning her pain into a lighthouse, while Mark and Beatrice were drowning in the sea they had created. The weeks turned into months, and the harsh reality of the city began to erode what little remained of Mark and Beatrice's pride. Life in the shelter was a grueling gauntlet of survival, a mirror of the very struggle they had once watched Elena endure with such indifference. Beatrice's health began to fail. The damp, cold air of the communal dormitories settled into her bones, turning her once intimidating stature into a hunched, frail frame. She spent her days huddled in a corner, clutching a threadbare blanket, her eyes darting around as if expecting Elena to appear from the shadows at any moment. The woman who had once used her voice like a whip was now reduced to a hoarse whisper, complaining to people who didn't care about a life she no longer possessed. Mark, on the other hand, was discovering a new kind of hell. In the shelter, he was a nobody. Without his mother's protection or a house to hide in, he was forced to face the world as the useless man Elena had described. He tried to sell his labor on street corners, standing in line with dozens of other men for a day's work, hauling bricks or clearing trash. But Mark had never learned the value of hard work. His hands were soft, and his spirit was even softer. After a few hours of manual labor, he would quit, his body aching and his mind filled with resentment. He blamed the system, he blamed the weather, but most of all, he blamed the two women in his life, one for leaving and the other for staying. Elena was keeping a close watch on their descent. She didn't need to be there physically to feel the satisfaction of the trap closing. She received weekly reports from a social worker she had discreetly put on her payroll not to help them, but to ensure they were meeting the full experience of their new lives. When she learned that Mark had been involved in a scuffle over a piece of bread and ended up with a black eye, she felt a cold shiver of vindication. It wasn't about cruelty. It was about the poetic symmetry of the universe. They were finally living the life they had designed for her. Every indignity they suffered was a debt being repaid, cent by cent, with interest. But Elena's plan had one more layer. She knew that the most effective way to break someone wasn't through poverty, but through the illusion of a second chance. She arranged for a charity representative to visit the shelter. This representative, a young woman with a kind face and a clipboard, approached Mark. She told him about a new initiative for rehabilitating displaced men that offered a small apartment and a steady job in a different city. Mark's eyes lit up with a desperate, pathetic hope. He saw a way out, a way to leave his mother behind and start over. He didn't hesitate for a second. He was ready to abandon Beatrice just as easily as he had abandoned Elena. The representative told him there was only one opening, and it required him to leave immediately. Mark didn't even go back to the dormitory to say goodbye to his mother. He signed the papers with a shaking hand, his heart thumping with the thrill of his own selfishness. He was led to a van, believing he was being whisked away to a new life. Instead, the van drove him to the outskirts of the city, to a remote industrial site where he was handed a broom and a shovel. The steady job was a position at a waste processing plant, and the apartment was a tiny, windowless trailer on the property. He was legally bound by the contract. He hadn't read a contract that dedicated his entire paycheck to housing and administrative fees. He had traded one prison for another, and this time there was no mother to blame. Beatrice, realizing Mark was gone, finally broke. The abandonment by her own son was the final blow to her psyche. She wandered the streets of the city, calling out his name, a ghostly figure in a tattered coat. She eventually found herself standing in front of a high-end electronics store. On the massive screens in the window, a news segment was playing. It was an interview with Elena, who was being honored as Philanthropist of the Year. Elena looked radiant, her voice steady and full of authority as she spoke about the importance of protecting the vulnerable. Beatrice pressed her face against the cold glass, tears streaming down her face, sobbing as she realized the world saw her servant as a saint, while she was nothing more than a stain on the sidewalk. Elena watched the footage of the electronics store from her security feed. She saw Beatrice collapse against the window, a broken heap of a woman. For a moment, a flicker of the old Elena, the one who wanted to help, the one who wanted to be loved, stirred in her chest. But then she remembered the smell of the burning soup on her wrist. She remembered the nights of silent weeping, while Mark slept soundly, indifferent to her pain. The flicker died out, replaced by a calm, unwavering resolve. She turned off the monitor. The lesson was nearly complete. She had dismantled their pride, their home, and finally, their bond with each other. She stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window of her office. The city stretched out before her, a grid of light and shadow. She had conquered the shadows, and now she owned the light. She had proven that a person's past does not define their future, but it certainly can dictate the fate of their enemies. She wasn't just Elena the victim anymore. She was Elena the architect. And as she looked down at the streets below, she knew that somewhere in that vast maze, two people were finally learning the true meaning of the words they had once used to crush her. The debt was settled. The industrial site where Mark now labored was a landscape of rust and relentless noise. Every day, he woke up in the cramped, humid trailer to the sound of a heavy siren. His job was the lowest on the ladder, sorting through mountains of metallic scrap and hazardous waste. The contract he had signed, under the guise of a fresh start, was a masterpiece of legal entrapment. It included clauses for training costs, equipment rental, and liability insurance, all of which were deducted from his meager hourly wage. At the end of each week, his paycheck amounted to less than $20. He was a corporate serf, trapped in a cycle of debt that mirrored the financial hole he had once helped dig for Elena. Mark's physical deterioration was rapid. The man who had once been too lazy to lift a finger was now forced to move tons of steel. His back ached with a dull, throbbing intensity that never left him. He began to hallucinate during the long night shifts, seeing Elena's face in the sparks of the grinders and the dark oil slicks on the floor. He remembered how he used to mock her for being tired after a double shift at the diner. Now, he understood that exhaustion wasn't just a physical feeling, it was a soul-crushing weight that made every second feel like an hour. He tried to run away once, but the facility was located miles from the nearest town, and the security fees for breaking his contract were enough to ensure he would be looking over his shoulder for the rest of his life. Back in the city, Beatrice had become a permanent fixture of the sidewalk near the Elena Foundation's new construction site. She didn't know why she stayed there. Perhaps it was a subconscious hope that Elena would see her and feel a pang of guilt. But guilt was a luxury Elena had discarded long ago. Beatrice watched as the old house, the site of her reign, was systematically dismantled. She saw the walls that had echoed with her screams of worthless being knocked down by a wrecking ball. She saw the kitchen, where she had burned Elena being gutted by men in yellow vests. Every brick that fell felt like a strike against her own body. One afternoon, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb near where Beatrice sat. A woman stepped out, but it wasn't Elena. It was her chief of staff, a woman with a face as hard as flint. She walked over to Beatrice and handed her a small, laminated card. On it was the address of a local clinic and a prepaid voucher for a single mental health evaluation. "Miss, Elena believes in second chances," the woman said, her voice devoid of emotion. "But only for those who are willing to admit what they've done." Beatrice looked at the card, her fingers shaking. For a moment, she had a choice. She could take the voucher, seek help, and perhaps find a sliver of peace in her final years. But Beatrice's pride was a cancer that had reached its terminal stage. She looked at the woman, spat on the sidewalk, and tore the card into tiny pieces. She screamed that she didn't need charity from a girl she had raised. She claimed she was still the queen of her domain, even as she sat in the dirt. The chief of staff simply nodded, walked back to the SUV, and drove away. That was the final test. Elena had offered a hand not out of love, but as a final assessment of Beatrice's character. By rejecting it, Beatrice had sealed her own fate. She had chosen to die in the bitterness of her own making, rather than live in the light of Elena's mercy. Elena received the report of the incident while she was at a gala for the city's most influential leaders. She was dressed in a gown of midnight blue, surrounded by people who hung on her every word. When she read that Beatrice had destroyed the voucher, she didn't feel angry. She felt a profound sense of closure. She realized that some people are so committed to their own darkness that they would rather burn out than change. She raised her glass in a silent toast, not to her enemies, but to the version of herself that had survived them. She was no longer defined by what they had done to her. She was defined by the fact that she had moved beyond them. The contrast between their lives was now absolute. Mark was a ghost in a machine, forgotten by the world he had tried to grift. Beatrice was a ghost on the street, haunted by a house that no longer existed. And Elena was the architect of a new reality. She spent the evening discussing the expansion of her foundation, her mind sharp and focused on the future. The revenge had served its purpose. It had been the fuel that got her through the darkest years, but she no longer needed that fire to keep her warm. She had built a sun of her own. As the gala ended, Elena walked out to her car, the cool night air refreshing against her skin. She looked up at the stars, realizing that the town, the house, and the people who had hurt her were now just tiny, insignificant points in her rearview mirror. She had achieved the ultimate victory. She had become someone they could never touch again. The cycle of abuse had stopped with her, transformed into a legacy of empowerment. She told her driver to take the long way home, wanting to see the city lights one more time before the sun rose on a world where she was finally, truly free. The silence of the city at 3 a.m. was a luxury Elena had learned to cherish. From her penthouse balcony, the world looked like a sprawling circuit board of light, and she was the one controlling the current. But while she lived in the clouds, the consequences of her design were reaching a fever pitch on the ground. The psychological trap she had set for Mark and Beatrice was moving into its final, most desolate phase, the phase of total isolation. She had dismantled their environment, their finances, and their health. Now, she was dismantling their memories. At the waste processing plant, Mark's mental state was deteriorating faster than his physical health. The constant, rhythmic pounding of the machinery began to sound like voices to him. He started to hear Elena's laughter in the steam vents and his mother's insults in the grinding of the gears. He was trapped in a sensory hell where the past and the present bled into one another. He attempted to reach out to the other workers to find some shred of human connection, but they looked through him as if he were already a ghost. Elena had ensured that the facility was staffed by people who were paid to ignore him. He was living in a crowded room where he was completely and utterly alone. One night, driven by a sudden, desperate impulse, Mark tried to steal a truck from the loading dock. He didn't have a plan. He just wanted to drive until the noise stopped. But the keys weren't in the ignition, and the moment he touched the door handle, silent alarms triggered a lockdown. He was tackled by security before he could even climb into the cab. Instead of calling the police, the manager, a man who took direct orders from one of Elena's many subsidiaries, simply smiled. He told Mark that his attempted theft had incurred a massive fine that would be added to his contract debt. Mark realized then that he would never leave this place. He was a permanent fixture of the rust in the oil, a living monument to his own worthlessness. Meanwhile, Beatrice had moved from the construction site to the park across the street. She had become a local urban legend, the woman who talked to the wind about a lost empire. She had stopped grooming herself, her clothes becoming a patchwork of found rags. But even in her madness, she retained a sliver of her old cruelty. She would hiss at young couples walking by, warning them that love was a lie and that everyone was out to steal what they had. She was a living warning, a physical manifestation of the toxicity that had once poisoned Elena's life. The townspeople, who once feared her, now looked at her with a mixture of pity and disgust, which was a fate far worse than being hated. Elena decided it was time to provide the final update to her victims. She didn't go herself, but she sent a digital tablet to the shelter manager, where Beatrice occasionally sought food, and another to the manager at Mark's plant. The tablets were programmed to play a single video on a loop. It was a high-production documentary about the grand opening of the Elena Center. The video showed the exact spot where their house had stood, now replaced by a stunning, glass-fronted building filled with light, laughter, and hope. It showed women being empowered, children playing in a safe garden, and Elena herself cutting a ribbon with a pair of golden shears. When Mark saw the video in the break room, he didn't scream or cry. He simply sat there, his grease-stained hands shaking, watching the life he had thrown away being turned into a paradise for everyone but him. He saw the spot where his favorite chair used to be, now occupied by a library where young women were studying for a better future. The irony was a physical blow to his gut. He realized that his mother's house was gone, his legacy was erased, and the woman he had treated like a servant was now the queen of the very ground he had walked on. He was a footnote in her story, and not even a significant one. Beatrice's reaction was more violent. When she saw the tablet at the soup kitchen, she tried to smash it against the table. But the device was encased in a heavy-duty frame, and her weak strikes did nothing. She watched Elena's face on the screen, the calm, radiant smile of a woman who had won. Beatrice began to wail, a sound so primal and full of agony that the other homeless people backed away in fear. She realized in that moment that she had lost the war of the mind. She had tried to make Elena believe she was nothing, but Elena had forced Beatrice to witness herself becoming nothing, while Elena became everything. Elena watched the footage of their reactions from a secure server. She felt a profound sense of equilibrium. She wasn't smiling. She was simply observing the completion of a process. She had taken two people who lived for themselves and forced them to live for her, even if only in their nightmares. She had replaced their reign of terror with a reign of grace. As she closed the laptop, she realized she had reached the end of her need for them. They were no longer her project. They were just shadows in the distance, fading as she walked further into the light of her new life. The industrial site was a graveyard of ambition, and Mark was its most faithful resident. As the 9th year of his new life began, he had ceased to be a man and had become a mechanical function. His skin was permanently stained with the gray soot of the processing plant, and his eyes had lost the ability to focus on anything beyond the immediate task of sorting scrap. He no longer dreamt of the beautiful woman from the social media profile or the millions he thought he was owed. His world had shrunk to the size of his shovel. Every muscle in his body burned with a chronic, searing pain that reminded him, with every heartbeat, of the woman he had failed to protect and the life he had failed to live. One evening, during a rare moment of silence when the machines were being serviced, Mark sat on a pile of rusted iron and looked at his hands. They were calloused, scarred, and trembling. He thought about the house, the small kitchen, and the way Elena used to look at him with hope before that hope turned into fear and eventually into nothing. He realized that his mother had fed him a poison of entitlement his entire life, making him believe he was a king in a castle that was actually a prison. He had been a willing participant in his own downfall, a passenger in a car driven by his mother's malice. For the first time, Mark felt a genuine pang of remorse, but it was too late. Remorse without the power to change is simply another form of torture. In the city, Beatrice's descent had reached its final plateau. She no longer wandered the streets. She had claimed a small corner under a bridge near the docks. Her mind was a fractured mirror, reflecting distorted images of the past. She would often hold conversations with the air, arguing with a version of Elena that existed only in her memory, a version that stayed silent and did as she was told. The reality of the modern world, with its gleaming skyscrapers and the omnipresent face of the new Elena on billboards, was too much for her to process. She retreated into a world where she was still in control, even as she scavenged for scraps of food in the trash bins of the wealthy. The final stroke of Elena's plan was not one of violence, but of ultimate indifference. She decided it was time to stop watching. The reports, the cameras, the private investigators, she cut them all off. She realized that by continuing to monitor them, she was still giving them a place in her life. To truly be free, she had to let them fade into the background radiation of the world. She gave instructions to her firm to settle the remaining debts of the waste plant and the shelter, but to keep the conditions exactly as they were. She wanted them to exist in a state of perpetual, stagnant consequence, but she no longer wanted to be the one holding the leash. Elena spent that afternoon at the Elena Foundation, walking through the hallways of the completed community center. The air was filled with the sound of piano music from a music room and the quiet hum of a computer lab. She met a young woman who had just escaped an abusive marriage, a woman who reminded her so much of her 35-year-old self. They spoke for a long time about the future, about the strength it takes to walk away, and about the importance of never looking back. Elena realized that this was her true revenge, not the suffering of Mark and Beatrice, but the thriving of the women who would come after her. She was building a fortress of light that no shadow could ever penetrate. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the glass and steel of the center, Elena felt a sense of peace that surpassed anything she had ever known. She had started this journey with a heart full of black ink, wanting to stain the lives of those who had hurt her. But through the process of rebuilding herself, that ink had been used to write a new story, one of resilience and triumph. She had taken the useless label they had branded her with and turned it into a badge of honor. She was proof that the most dangerous person in the world is the one who has been pushed to the edge and decided to fly instead of fall. She walked out to the garden, where a small fountain bubbled in the center of a courtyard. She took a deep breath of the evening air, which smelled of jasmine and the promise of a quiet night. She thought about the night she left the house with nothing but a bag and a few $100s. She thought about the rain and the cold and the terror of the unknown. That woman was gone now, replaced by someone who knew her worth to the very cent. Elena looked at her reflection in the water of the fountain. She didn't see a victim or a vengeful ghost. She saw a woman who had finally come home to herself. That night, Elena went to sleep without checking the security feeds. She didn't think about the waste plant or the bridge under the docks. She didn't think about the soup or the insults or the years of wasted youth. She slept the deep, dreamless sleep of the truly liberated. The ghosts had been laid to rest, not with a bang, but with a quiet closing of a door. The story of the girl who was broken was over, and the story of the woman who was whole had finally begun its most beautiful chapter. The final chapter of this long and grueling journey did not conclude with a grand explosion or a public trial. Instead, it ended with a silence that was far more profound. In the cold, industrial outskirts where Mark lived, the machinery finally stopped for a scheduled decommissioning of the plant. For the first time in years, the air was still. Mark sat on the edge of his narrow cot, his body a map of scars and exhaustion. He looked out the small, reinforced window at the horizon. He realized that even if he walked away now, he had nowhere to go. He had become a man without a shadow, a person whose existence had been so thoroughly dismantled that even the world seemed to have forgotten he was there. Elena's final act of revenge was the most powerful of all. She had simply moved on, leaving him to live in a world where he no longer mattered. In the city, the winter air was biting as it whipped under the bridge where Beatrice spent her days. She was curled up in a nest of old newspapers, her eyes closed as she drifted in and out of a feverish sleep. In her mind, she was back in her kitchen, the light was warm, and she was powerful. She could hear the sound of the stove and the clinking of dishes, but when she opened her eyes, she saw only the gray concrete and the indifferent rush of the river. She reached out a hand, calling for a son who wouldn't come and a daughter-in-law she had driven away. The bitter cold was the only thing that embraced her. She had spent her life trying to diminish others, only to find herself the smallest thing in a vast, uncaring universe. Elena, now a symbol of grace and indomitable spirit, stood at the podium of a national conference for social change. She was no longer looking back at the wreckage of her past. She was looking forward. She spoke to thousands of people about the power of self-reinvention and the necessity of breaking the cycles of domestic tyranny. She didn't mention Mark or Beatrice by name. They were merely the obstacles she had overcome to become the woman she was today. To the world, she was a beacon of hope. To herself, she was finally at peace. She had learned that true power isn't found in hurting those who hurt you, but in building a life so magnificent that their memory can no longer find a place to stay. The Elena Foundation grew into an international network, providing sanctuary for thousands who were trapped in the same darkness she had once known. Every success story that emerged from the center was a final nail in the coffin of her old life. She had taken the bad hand she was dealt and played it with a master's precision, proving that the human spirit, when pushed to its limits, can either shatter or turn into a diamond. Elena chose the diamond. She chose to be the light that guides others out of the storm. As she walked off the stage to a standing ovation, she felt the last remnants of the old anger dissolve. The debt was paid, the story was written, and the woman who was once nothing had become everything. Behind the scenes of her empire, Elena lived a life of quiet elegance. She surrounded herself with beauty, art, and people who valued her for her mind and her heart. She never remarried. Her independence was a treasure she wasn't willing to compromise. Sometimes, on rainy nights, she would sit by her fireplace with a glass of wine and remember the girl she used to be. She didn't look at that girl with pity anymore, but with a deep, abiding respect. That girl had survived so the woman could thrive. Elena would raise her glass to the darkness, acknowledging its role in making her appreciate the light, and then she would turn the page to a new day. As for the town where it all began, the memory of the evil mother-in-law and the useless husband faded into local legend, eventually becoming nothing more than a ghost story told to warn people about the dangers of greed and cruelty. The spot where their house once stood remained a place of healing, a vibrant park where flowers bloomed in the spring and children laughed in the summer. The soil that had once absorbed the tears of a broken woman now nourished the roots of 1,000 trees. The transformation was complete. The past had been buried, and in its place, something beautiful had grown. Elena had won the war, not by destroying her enemies, but by outliving their influence and outgrowing their world. Thank you so much for joining us on this intense journey through betrayal and ultimate triumph. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more tales of resilience and justice, please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Dr. Harmony. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories to life. See you in the next video.